Close your eyes for a moment and think about the 1980s. The neon lights, the Saturday morning cartoons, the cassette tapes winding inside your Walkman, and of course, the cafeteria table where you traded snacks with your friends. For kids of that decade, the magic wasn't only in the music or the toys, it was also in the drinks we sipped, slurped, and sometimes spilled down our school clothes. These weren't just beverages, they were badges of childhood, little bursts of flavor that marked the moments we laughed with friends or watched cartoons on a living room TV bigger than the furniture itself. But here's the kicker, many of those drinks are gone forever. Vanished from the shelves, erased from the vending machines, left only in the hazy glow of memory. They were bold, weird, sugary, and sometimes downright experimental, and while they didn't all last, they each left a mark on the kids who loved them. If you grew up in that era, this is your trip back in time. And if you didn't, consider this your crash course into the fizzy, fruity, neon-colored world of 80s childhood drinks. Stick around, because as we walk through these forgotten flavors, you'll laugh, you'll cringe, and you might even wish you could run to the corner store one more time for a can of pure nostalgia. The thirst for the extraordinary. The 1980s were a decade of excess, invention, and cultural explosions. Everything was bigger, louder, and brighter. That energy spilled right into the world of kids' drinks. From bold sodas that challenged tradition to bizarre experimental flavors that only a child could truly love, the beverage aisle of the 80s was like a candy store in liquid form. Kids didn't just drink soda, they lived it. Commercials blared during Saturday morning cartoons, mascots danced across lunchboxes, and every new flavor was a chance to make the cafeteria table buzz. Drinks weren't about hydration, they were about identity. Were you a Jolt Cola rebel? An Ecto Cooler fanboy? A Pepsi-free loyalist? These choices mattered, because in the 80s, branding was everything. Now, let's pour a tall glass of nostalgia and revisit some of the most iconic, forgotten drinks that defined an entire generation. 1. Jolt Cola, all the sugar and twice the caffeine. Jolt Cola was not just a drink, it was a cultural dare. Launched in 1985, it came at a time when parents and schools were starting to panic about sugar intake and caffeine overload. Every headline warned about kids bouncing off the walls, yet here came Jolt Cola, proudly boasting on its can, all the sugar and twice the caffeine. It was less a marketing slogan and more a middle finger to authority. For kids, drinking Jolt was a statement. It meant you weren't satisfied with ordinary Coke or Pepsi, you wanted something edgier, something that felt like it belonged to rock bands and computer hackers. In fact, Jolt became an underground legend in teenage culture. High schoolers would chug it before all-night study sessions or sneak it into sleepovers to keep the video game marathons alive until dawn. The taste itself wasn't revolutionary, it was cola, plain and simple. But the promise of Jolt was what sold it. It made you feel like you were part of something rebellious, something parents didn't approve of. And that was priceless in the 80s. Looking back now, Jolt feels like a forerunner of today's energy drinks. Red Bull, Monster, Rockstar, they all owe a little nod to that black can with the electric bolt running down the side. Jolt may not exist anymore on every store shelf, but its spirit of over-the-top energy lives on in every neon-colored can kids grab today. 2. Hi-C Ecto Cooler, Slimer in a juice box. If you were a kid in the late 80s, chances are you still remember the first time you saw Slimer, the goofy green ghost from Ghostbusters, plastered on a juice box. That was Hi-C Ecto Cooler, launched in 1987 as a tie-in to the Ghostbusters animated series. The drink itself was technically just a rebranded citrus punch, but the marketing was genius. Kids didn't care what was in it, they just knew it was radioactive green, had Slimer on the front, and tasted like liquid sugar with a splash of citrus. At lunch, kids who pulled an Ecto Cooler from their lunchbox instantly had everyone's attention. It wasn't just a drink, it was a conversation starter, a social currency. Ecto Cooler stuck around longer than most expected. Even after the Ghostbusters cartoon ended, the drink kept selling under the same name. Kids who had grown up with it in the late 80s were still sipping it well into the 90s, proving that sometimes marketing magic can outlive its source material. Today, Ecto Cooler is one of the most legendary discontinued drinks. When the Ghostbusters reboot was announced in 2016, Coca-Cola briefly brought it back, sparking massive nostalgia. Adults who grew up in the 80s flocked to buy it, not for the flavor, but for the memory of sitting cross-legged on the carpet, juice box in hand, watching Slimer cause chaos on Saturday mornings. 3. Pepsi Free, the caffeine-free rebel. Long before Back to the Future made it a punchline, Pepsi Free was one of the boldest soda experiments of the 80s. Launched in 1982, it was Pepsi's attempt to create a caffeine-free cola that still gave kids the thrill of soda without the buzz. At first glance, Pepsi Free didn't seem like much of a risk, it was just cola without caffeine. But the 80s were all about branding, and Pepsi leaned hard into the idea that Pepsi Free was modern, forward-thinking, and even a little futuristic. Its name alone felt unusual. People weren't used to hearing soda described in terms of what it didn't have. Pepsi Free came in bright red cans, a bold contrast from Pepsi's classic blue, and it quickly stood out on store shelves. Kids were drawn to it partly because of the cool branding, but also because parents were more likely to allow them to drink it since it skipped caffeine. For children, that meant being able to enjoy soda late at night, at sleepovers, or even during school events without parents worrying they'd be bouncing off the walls. Of course, it gained a kind of immortal pop culture status in 1985, thanks to Marty McFly's confused diner order in Back to the Future, "Can I get a Pepsi Free?" To which the 1950s server deadpans, "If you want a Pepsi, you're gonna pay for it." That single joke gave Pepsi Free more lasting fame than most of its advertising campaigns ever did. The drink itself eventually faded, replaced by Pepsi Caffeine Free. But for 80s kids, Pepsi Free was the cola that seemed futuristic, cool, and slightly misunderstood, much like the decade itself. Even today, collectors hunt for the red cans as retro treasures, a fizzy reminder of when even removing caffeine felt like a rebellious innovation. 4. Hubba Bubba Soda, bubblegum in a bottle. Nothing screams 1980s excess like the idea of bubblegum-flavored soda. Hubba Bubba Soda was exactly that, a liquid version of the famous bubblegum brand, launched in the mid-80s. It came in loud, neon-colored cans that looked like they belonged in an arcade, and the taste? Well, it was bubblegum. Pure, unapologetic bubblegum. Kids loved it because it felt like something adults would never approve of. Soda was already a treat, but soda that tasted like candy. That was forbidden fruit. Parents were baffled, adults often hated it, but to kids, it was the ultimate sugar rush in liquid form. Drinking Hubba Bubba soda was more than just refreshment, it was an event. Kids would dare each other to chug it, mix it with other sodas at birthday parties, or pair it with actual gum for the ultimate sugar overload. Some even swore it tasted slightly different depending on whether you drank it ice cold or room temperature, making it a kind of mini experiment in flavor. Part of its charm was its novelty. You didn't drink Hubba Bubba soda every day, you bragged about it when you found it at a store or convinced your parents to buy it as a rare treat. It was the kind of drink that made your friends crowd around, curious, daring each other to try it. Kids traded stories about it like urban legends, who had tried it, who actually liked it, and who got in trouble for drinking too much of it. Of course, it didn't last. By the late 80s, Hubba Bubba soda was gone, remembered mostly by those who loved its strange, over-the-top flavor. But its spirit lives on in every weird soda experiment that dares to push the boundary between candy and cola. To this day, nostalgic fans wonder what it would be like if the brand gave it another shot, even if just as a limited-time stunt. 5. Slice, fruit soda with attitude. Before there was Sierra Mist, before there was Pepsi's attempt at healthy soda branding, there was Slice. Launched in 1984, Slice was Pepsi's answer to 7-Up and Sprite, but with a twist. It claimed to contain 10% real fruit juice. That small percentage became its whole identity. For kids, Slice felt a little more grown-up than Sprite or 7-Up. The commercials were loud, colorful, and full of attitude, and the flavors went beyond the basics. There was lemon-lime slice, sure, but also orange slice, apple slice, grape slice, and even peach slice. It felt experimental, and for a while, it really worked. Kids who brought Slice to lunch were signaling that they were a little different, a little cooler. The branding leaned into that, with bright cans and slogans that made Slice seem less like soda and more like a lifestyle. By the 90s, Slice began to fade, replaced by Pepsi's newer brands. But for a glorious window in the 80s, Slice was everywhere, from vending machines at roller rinks to cans stacked in neon-lit arcades. It was one of those sodas that didn't just quench your thirst, it made you feel like you were part of something bigger. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at how strange some of these drinks were. Bubblegum soda. Pineapple burgers. A cola that bragged about having too much sugar. But the truth is, they captured the spirit of the 80s perfectly. They were bold, experimental, unafraid to fail, and endlessly entertaining. Kids didn't just drink these sodas, they collected memories with them. They were part of birthday parties, little league games, movie nights, and long afternoons spent riding bikes until the streetlights came on. Even though they're gone, they left behind something sweeter than sugar: nostalgia. 6. Crystal Pepsi, clear, cool, and confusing. Crystal Pepsi is perhaps one of the most memorable soda experiments of all time, even though it technically didn't make its full debut until the early 1990s. But the development phase and buzz around it started in the late 80s, when Pepsi executives wanted to chase the purity craze sweeping through consumer products. At the time, being transparent or crystal clear was synonymous with futuristic innovation. Phones were clear, video game consoles had see-through shells, and even sneakers had translucent sections. It was a trend kids instantly connected with, because it looked cool and different. When Crystal Pepsi finally hit shelves, it was a phenomenon. Kids would bring it to school just to show off the see-through soda, holding it up to the light like it was some kind of magic potion. Teachers and parents were baffled by it, but kids were mesmerized. It looked like sparkling water, but it fizzed and tasted faintly of cola. The commercials, featuring Van Halen's Right Now, pushed it as not just a soda, but a revolution in refreshment. The taste, however, was polarizing. It wasn't identical to Pepsi, less caramel flavor, lighter, and sweeter, but kids didn't care at first. The allure of a clear soda was powerful. But over time, novelty wore off. Adults found it strange, and even kids eventually drifted back to the reliable fizz of regular Pepsi or Coca-Cola. By the mid-90s, Crystal Pepsi was discontinued, but its legacy has endured as a perfect example of how the 80s and 90s loved bold experiments. Today, it's remembered fondly not because it was delicious, but because it was daring. 7. New Coke, the Cola War misstep. Few product launches shook the soda world like New Coke in 1985. Coca-Cola, after years of losing ground to Pepsi in taste tests and marketing to younger audiences, decided to reformulate their iconic drink. The result was New Coke, a smoother, sweeter soda meant to appeal to changing tastes. Kids in the 80s were somewhat shielded from the outrage that surrounded New Coke. To them, it was just soda, it still came in the red can, it still fizzed, and it still went great with popcorn on movie night. But what they couldn't miss was the sheer level of chaos it caused. Adults were furious. Protests sprang up across the US. People hoarded cases of old Coke in basements as if preparing for the end of the world. Late-night comedians mocked the decision relentlessly. It was one of the first times children saw a brand misstep dominate the news cycle, and it was unforgettable. For kids, New Coke almost became a secret indulgence. Since adults hated it so passionately, some children leaned into liking it just to feel rebellious. It was sweeter, after all, which appealed to young palates. But the rebellion was short-lived. Coca-Cola quickly bowed to pressure and reintroduced Coca-Cola Classic within a few months, relegating New Coke to one of the most infamous flops in history. In hindsight, New Coke taught kids an important lesson about nostalgia. Sometimes the things we grow up with are sacred, and changing them can cause chaos. It also cemented Coca-Cola's dominance for the rest of the decade, as Coke Classic became a permanent label and a cultural touchstone for years to come. 8. OK Soda, the drink that didn't care. If the 80s were about bright colors, sugary flavors, and over-the-top marketing, the early 90s, born from that era, leaned into irony. Coca-Cola's 1993 launch of OK Soda was one of the strangest beverage experiments ever, and though it came after the official 80s, its roots were tied to the experimentation of that decade. OK Soda wasn't just a drink, it was an attitude. Its cans came wrapped in grayscale artwork that looked like something out of a comic book scene. The slogans were cryptic, things like "What's the point?" and "Everything is going to be okay," echoing a kind of detached cynicism. For Gen X teens, this felt fresh and rebellious. For younger kids, the marketing was confusing, but that didn't stop them from being curious. The flavor was hard to pin down. Some described it as a mix of orange soda and cola, others thought it had hints of root beer or even cough syrup. But the taste almost didn't matter. OK Soda was about vibe. It felt like something underground, something that wasn't trying too hard, unlike the bombastic ads of the 80s featuring mascots bursting through walls. Though it flopped in under 2 years, it left an impression. Kids who tried it felt like they were drinking something that wasn't meant for everyone, something cool, weird, and exclusive. Today, OK Soda has a cult following, with collectors paying big money for unopened cans. For kids of the era, it was a reminder that soda wasn't just about refreshment, it could also be a statement. 9. Pepsi AM, breakfast in a can. By the late 80s, caffeine was becoming a selling point, not just an ingredient. People were busier, mornings were rushed, and coffee wasn't cool with kids. Pepsi saw an opportunity, why not market soda as a breakfast drink? Thus, Pepsi AM was born in 1989, boasting 28% more caffeine than regular Pepsi. The commercials leaned into this idea hard. They portrayed Pepsi AM as a legitimate morning beverage, positioning it next to orange juice and coffee on the breakfast table. Adults might have rolled their eyes, but kids found it hilarious, and strangely appealing. What child didn't dream of drinking soda with pancakes and eggs? For some, Pepsi AM became a mischievous thrill. Kids would sneak a can from the fridge before school, pretending it was part of their morning routine. Others bragged about it in lunchrooms, showing off the bold black and gold cans as proof that they had the energy of a grown-up. But Pepsi AM was short-lived. It never caught on with the masses, mostly because coffee drinkers weren't giving up their morning ritual. Yet it remains a quirky part of soda history, one that speaks to the 80s obsession with pushing boundaries, even if the idea was a little too ahead of its time. 10. Pepsi Blue, Berry Blast Experiment. If you grew up in the late 80s or early 90s, you might remember how obsessed companies became with neon colors. That aesthetic bled into the early 2000s, and Pepsi Blue was the ultimate expression of it. Released in 2002 but conceived from ideas that took root in the experimental soda phase of the late 80s, Pepsi Blue was a shock to the senses. The drink was bright, electric blue, so artificial-looking it seemed radioactive. Kids loved it. Opening a bottle of Pepsi Blue felt like unlocking a video game power-up. On cafeteria tables, it stood out like a glowing beacon, and kids instantly knew it wasn't just soda. The taste. Sweet, fruity, and undeniably candy-like, somewhere between a melted blue popsicle and liquid cotton candy. For some kids, it was an instant favorite. For others, it was too much. But everyone remembered it. The sheer audacity of Pepsi Blue, right down to the commercials featuring the band Papa Roach, cemented it as a generational marker. Though it disappeared after just a couple of years, Pepsi Blue remains one of the most requested bring-back drinks from nostalgic fans. For kids who grew up with it, Pepsi Blue wasn't just a soda. It was a cultural moment, bottled and carbonated. 11. Squeeze It, the sippable fun bottles. While cans and bottles dominated the soda aisle, the late 80s also gave kids one of the most fun drink designs ever, Squeeze It. These colorful plastic bottles weren't just containers, they were characters. Each one was shaped like a goofy face or cartoon figure, and kids could squeeze the bottle to shoot the sugary liquid straight into their mouths. The flavors came with playful names like Chucklin, Cherry and Mean Green Puncher, and they weren't subtle. These were neon-colored sugar bombs that lit up lunchboxes across America. The real appeal, however, was the bottle itself. Kids would save the empties, use them as squirt toys, or crush them dramatically after finishing. Unlike juice boxes or pouches, Squeeze It made drinking feel interactive. Parents didn't always love the sticky mess, but kids adored them. Eventually discontinued, Squeeze It has become one of those products that instantly sparks nostalgia. For many, nothing says 80s childhood quite like the sight of those little plastic bottles lined up in the fridge. 12. Kool-Aid Bursts, Twist, Drink, Repeat. Kool-Aid was already iconic by the 80s, thanks to its mascot, the Kool-Aid Man, and his legendary, "Oh yeah," catchphrase. But Kool-Aid Bursts, introduced toward the end of the decade, elevated the brand to new heights. These came in plastic bottles with colorful twist-off tops. The act of opening one, twisting the top until it popped, was half the fun. Kids would sometimes collect the tops, trade them, or string them together like trophies. The flavors were classic Kool-Aid, bold, tangy, and bursting with sugar, but the delivery system made them feel futuristic. Lunchrooms and playgrounds lit up with these bottles. Kids would compare flavors, race to finish them, and occasionally spray each other with the sugary liquid. They weren't just drinks, they were props in the theater of childhood. By the late 90s, Kool-Aid Burst started fading out, replaced by other fads. But for 80s kids, the memory of those twisty tops and neon liquids remains one of the sweetest and stickiest parts of growing up. Looking back, what stands out most isn't just the flavors or the packaging. It's how these drinks defined moments of childhood. They weren't simply beverages, they were experiences. Crystal Pepsi made kids feel like they were tasting the future. New Coke showed them the power of nostalgia. Squeeze It turned a simple juice into a toy. Kool-Aid Burst transformed a lunch break into an adventure. The 80s and early 90s were a golden age of drink innovation, full of wild experiments that sometimes failed spectacularly, but always left a mark. And while most of these drinks no longer exist, their memory lingers in the people who grew up with them. They remind us that childhood wasn't just about what we drank, it was about the excitement, the wonder, and the joy of discovering something new.